The story begins on a crisp summer morning with the sound of birds chirping outside a modest suburban home. Sarah, a vibrant woman in her late 30s, was standing in the kitchen, sipping her coffee and nervously glancing at the clock. She was about to embark on an adventure she had never imagined, one that could either strengthen her bond with her stepson, Ethan, or push them further apart. Ethan, a quiet yet observant 14-year-old, sat at the dining table scrolling through his phone, barely acknowledging her presence. This trip was supposed to be their chance to connect, but neither of them really knew what to expect. It all started when Sarah found an old journal in the attic, left behind by Ethan's late mother. The pages were filled with notes, sketches, and mentions of a road trip she had always dreamed of taking with Ethan. As Sarah read through it, a mixture of emotions overwhelmed her: sadness, hope, and a spark of determination. She wanted to honor those dreams and create a positive memory for Ethan, one they could both carry forward. But the idea of traveling together for a week, just the two of them, was daunting. They weren't exactly close. Sure, they lived under the same roof, but their relationship often felt like two strangers navigating their way around each other. When Sarah brought up the idea of the trip, Ethan's reaction was predictable: a shrug, accompanied by a muttered, "Sure, I guess." That wasn't exactly the enthusiastic response she had hoped for, but it was better than a flat-out no. Deep down, Sarah knew this trip was a gamble. It could be the bridge that finally connected them, or the journey that made their differences more obvious than ever. Fast forward to today, as they loaded their suitcases into the car, an awkward silence filled the air. Sarah kept trying to make small talk, but Ethan's answers were short and polite, as if he was testing how much effort she would put in. Sarah didn't blame him. She understood how hard it must be for him to accept her in his life. She wasn't trying to replace his mother. She knew that was impossible. She just wanted to be someone he could trust, maybe even lean on someday. Their first destination was a quaint little-known mountain town, a spot Ethan's mom had circled in her journal with the note, "The perfect place to unwind." As they drove along winding roads, the scenery grew more breathtaking, with lush green forests and the occasional sparkling river. For a moment, Sarah thought she caught Ethan smiling as he looked out the window, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. What neither of them knew was that this trip would lead to moments neither could have predicted. From unexpected detours to emotional revelations, their journey would test their patience, challenge their assumptions, and maybe, just maybe, bring them closer together. But as they approached the town, a wrong turn landed them in an eerie, deserted area that wasn't on the map. Ethan finally spoke up, his voice tinged with curiosity and concern. "Are we lost?" Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel as her eyes darted between the GPS on her phone and the unfamiliar dirt road ahead. The device had lost its signal a few minutes back, leaving them to navigate on instinct. The trees seemed to close in around them, their tall, shadowy forms casting an eerie silence over the car. Sarah forced a calm tone as she answered Ethan's question. "I don't think we're lost, just a little off course. Let's see where this takes us." She hoped the confidence in her voice sounded more real than it felt. Ethan leaned forward, looking out the windshield, with a mix of curiosity and unease. "This doesn't look like the pictures we saw," he said, his voice low but clear. Sarah glanced at him, noticing how his guarded expression mirrored her own sense of uncertainty. She wasn't sure whether to turn back or keep going, but something about this path felt like it had its own story to tell. The road eventually opened into a clearing where an old wooden sign leaned precariously to one side. The faded paint was barely legible, but Sarah could just make out the words, "Riverbend Lodge, 3 miles ahead." She vaguely remembered reading about the lodge in the journal. There was a short note next to its name, a hidden gem perfect for stargazing. Sarah's heart leapt at the connection, but something about the place didn't match the idyllic description. The air felt heavy, and even Ethan seemed to sense it. Should we turn around? Ethan asked, his tone more serious now. He was gripping the strap of his backpack as though preparing for something unexpected. Sarah hesitated, torn between following the journal's trail and her growing unease. Let's just check it out, she said finally. We've come this far, right? As they drove further, the surroundings grew stranger. The road narrowed, and the trees seemed older, their gnarled branches stretching toward the car like fingers. Every now and then, Sarah thought she saw movement out of the corner of her eye, a flash of something darting between the trees. But every time she looked, there was nothing there. Ethan must have noticed her uneasiness because he finally spoke again, trying to lighten the mood. This is like the start of one of those horror movies you hate, he joked, but his nervous laugh didn't hide the tension in his voice. Sarah gave a half-hearted chuckle. Yeah, well, let's hope it's more of an adventure movie with a happy ending, she replied, though the pit in her stomach disagreed. The car rounded a bend, and suddenly the lodge came into view. A sprawling, weathered structure that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Its windows were dark, and the surrounding area was eerily still. For a moment, neither of them said a word. The quiet felt deafening. Ethan broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. Mom wrote about this place? Sarah nodded, her eyes fixed on the lodge, as if it might vanish if she looked away. She did, she said, her voice steady but soft. And now it's our turn to find out why. Sarah parked the car a short distance from the lodge, unsure if they should get any closer. The building loomed in front of them, its wooden exterior weathered by time and neglect. Vines crept up the sides, and the surrounding silence felt unnatural, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Ethan leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. It doesn't look welcoming, he muttered, his unease clear. Sarah felt it too, but the journal had led them here, and something about the place tugged at her curiosity. I think we should take a look, Sarah said, though her voice wavered. She opened the car door, and the sound of gravel crunching under her feet broke the stillness. Ethan hesitated before following, clutching his backpack tightly. They approached the lodge slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. The wooden steps creaked under their weight, and Sarah hesitated at the door. A tarnished plaque next to it read, Established 1924. She reached for the handle, and the door creaked open with a groan, as though it had been waiting for them. Inside, the air was musty, and the faint scent of wood smoke lingered. The lobby was filled with mismatched furniture, covered in a thin layer of dust. A grand fireplace dominated the room, its hearth cold and empty. Ethan wandered toward a faded map pinned to the wall, studying it closely. It's like time stopped here, he said, his voice tinged with wonder and apprehension. Sarah's gaze fell on a leather-bound guest book resting on the counter. The pages were yellowed, but when she flipped through, she froze. One of the herself, it was the building settling, or an animal that had wandered in. But deep down, she knew this was different. Entries caught her eye, a signature she recognized. Ethan's mother. Next to it was a date that didn't make sense. Sarah's chest tightened as she whispered, This can't be right. Ethan turned to her, confused. What is it? Before she could answer, a faint sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the lodge. Footsteps. Both of them froze, their eyes meeting as fear and question swirled between them. The sound of footsteps grew louder, each one deliberate and echoing in the stillness of the lodge. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her fingers tightening on the guest book. Ethan stood frozen by the map, his wide eyes darting toward the dark hallway at the back of the room. Did you hear that? He whispered, his voice trembling. Sarah nodded slowly, motioning for him to stay close. She set the guest book down carefully, as if any sudden movement might provoke whatever, or whoever, was coming. The faint creaking of wood under unseen steps seemed to circle them, growing closer and then retreating, like a predator playing with its prey. Sarah tried to convince, maybe it's just the wind, she offered, her voice shaky but firm, hoping to calm Ethan or herself. Ethan shook his head, his eyes locked on the shadowy hallway. That's not the wind, he said quietly. The air felt heavier now, as though the lodge itself was alive, watching them. Sarah's mind raced. She thought about the journal, the cryptic notes Ethan's mother had left about this place, and the strange date next to her signature. None of it made sense, but there was something here, something connected to her stepson's past and his mother's unfinished dreams. A sudden thud broke the silence, this time coming from upstairs. Both of them jumped, their eyes snapping toward the staircase. We should leave, Ethan said, his voice urgent. But Sarah couldn't move. She was caught between her fear and the overwhelming feeling that they were meant to find something here, no matter how terrifying it might be. As she opened her mouth to respond, a faint, familiar voice echoed from upstairs. It called Ethan's name. Ethan's name hung in the air, the faint voice sending chills down Sarah's spine. She turned to Ethan, whose face had gone pale. Did you hear that? He whispered, barely able to get the words out. Sarah nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice had sounded so distant, yet somehow unmistakably familiar. It wasn't possible, she told herself. It couldn't be. Ethan took a hesitant step back, his hand gripping Sarah's arm. That sounded like her, he said, his voice cracking. Sarah's mind reeled. Ethan's mother was gone, had been for years. There was no rational explanation for what they had just heard, but her maternal instinct to protect Ethan overpowered her fear. It's probably just the wind playing tricks on us, she said, though the quiver in her voice betrayed her own disbelief. The sound came again, this time louder and clearer. Ethan! It echoed down the staircase, freezing them both in place. Ethan's grip tightened. We need to leave, now, he insisted, his voice firm despite the panic in his eyes. But Sarah hesitated, drawn by a strange pull she couldn't explain. Every instinct told her to grab Ethan and run, but the journal, the lodge, and now this voice, it all felt too connected to ignore. Before she could decide, the floor beneath them creaked loudly, as if someone, or something, was walking right above them. Sarah's eyes darted to the staircase, and before she could stop him, Ethan broke free of her grip and bolted toward it. Ethan, wait, she called, but he was already halfway up, driven by a mix of fear and determination. Sarah followed, her heart pounding as they ascended the creaking steps. The second floor was dimly lit by streaks of light filtering through broken shutters. Dust swirled in the air as they entered a long hallway lined with closed doors. The voice called again, softer this time, but unmistakably closer. Ethan stopped in front of one door, his hand hovering over the handle. It's coming from here, he said, his voice barely audible. Sarah reached him just as he turned the knob. The door creaked open to reveal a room frozen in time. A small desk, a chair, and an unmade bed sat untouched, as if someone had just stepped out. On the desk was a photo frame, face down, and a notebook identical to the one Sarah had found in the attic. Ethan walked slowly to the desk and picked up the photo. His breath hitched. It's her, he whispered, holding up a picture of his mother. But before Sarah could process it, a sudden loud bang from behind them made them whirl around. The door had slammed shut, locking them inside. Ethan and Sarah spun around. their eyes locked on the door that had slammed shut, trapping them in the room. Sarah rushed to the door, jiggling the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "It's stuck," she said, her voice shaking. Ethan clutched the photo of his mother tightly, his knuckles white. "Why is this happening?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah didn't have an answer. She was as scared and confused as he was. The air in the room seemed to grow colder, and a faint, almost imperceptible hum filled the space. Sarah turned back toward the desk, her eyes falling on the notebook sitting beside the overturned photo frame. It looked identical to the journal she had found in the attic, but this one had no dust, as if it had been recently used. Slowly, she reached for it, her hands trembling. As soon as she opened the notebook, the hum grew louder and the pages began to flutter on their own. Both Sarah and Ethan stepped back, their hearts racing as the notebook stopped on a page filled with handwritten notes and sketches. At the top of the page, a single phrase was scrawled in bold letters: "Finish what we started." "What does that mean?" Ethan asked, his voice cracking. Sarah scanned the page, her eyes catching fragments of plans for the trip they were now on, the lodge, the journal, and even their arrival today. But the strangest part was a line written at the bottom: "The answers are in the stars." Suddenly, the windows of the room burst open, and a gust of cold wind swept through, sending papers flying. The wind seemed to carry whispers, soft, indistinct voices, until one voice rose above the rest. It was warm and familiar, filled with a sense of love and urgency. "Ethan," it said again, this time clear and unmistakable, "you're not alone." Ethan's grip on the photo tightened as tears welled in his eyes. "Mom?" he whispered, stepping toward the window. Sarah reached out to stop him, but before she could, the notebook on the desk glowed faintly, and the pages flipped to a drawing of a constellation. The same words were scrawled beneath it: "The answers are in the stars." Then, as quickly as it had begun, the wind stopped, and the room fell silent. The door creaked open on its own, as if inviting them to leave. But as they turned to go, Ethan looked back at the desk. The notebook was gone, leaving only the overturned photo frame. Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder, guiding him out. Neither of them spoke, but they both felt it: the presence of something bigger, something that had been with them all along. Ethan and Sarah walked slowly down the creaking staircase, the lodge now eerily quiet. Neither spoke as they reached the front door, their minds spinning with everything that had just happened. Ethan still held the photo of his mother tightly, his fingers brushing over her familiar smile. Sarah glanced at him, her heart aching. She wanted to say something comforting, something that might make sense of it all, but the words just wouldn't come. When they stepped outside, the fresh air hit them, crisp and grounding. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. For a moment, the two of them stood there, soaking in the stillness. The lodge, once foreboding and mysterious, now seemed oddly peaceful. Sarah looked up at the sky, remembering the note in the journal: "The answers are in the stars." Ethan followed her gaze, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he spoke. "Do you think she was really here?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. Sarah turned to him, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes. "I don't know," she admitted honestly, "but I think she wanted us to be here, to find this together." Ethan nodded, his grip on the photo loosening slightly. "She always loved looking at the stars," he said, his voice tinged with a bittersweet warmth. "Maybe that's what she meant. Maybe we're supposed to remember her that way, out there, part of something bigger." As they climbed back into the car, the tension between them felt lighter, almost like the weight of the trip had brought them closer. Sarah started the engine, glancing one last time at the lodge in the rearview mirror. The sense of closure she hadn't realized she was searching for began to settle in her chest. The drive back was quieter, but not uncomfortable. Ethan seemed lost in thought, holding the photo in his lap. "Thanks for bringing me here," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the hum of the engine. Sarah glanced at him, her heart swelling. "Of course," she replied. It's what she would have wanted. As the road stretched ahead of them, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Ethan rolled down the window, leaning his head out slightly to take in the view. For the first time, Sarah felt like they were more than just stepmom and stepson. They were family, and though they didn't have all the answers,